As she grew older, her family began thinking about what kind of future she could have. For many daughters, marriage was the expected destination. But arranging a marriage was not as simple as finding someone she liked. Families had to consider property, social position, reputation, religion, and above all, resources. For a wealthy family, a daughter might be married with land, money, clothing, jewelry, or other property that helped establish the new household. These marriage portions could be valuable, and the more desirable the match, the more complicated the negotiations could become. For a poor family, the situation was very different. A daughter might have little or nothing to bring into a marriage. Her parents could not simply create land or wealth that did not exist. If the family was already struggling to feed everyone, setting aside resources for a daughter's future marriage could be extremely difficult.
And this could quietly change the course of her entire life. Instead of leaving home as a bride, she might remain there for years. At first, nobody necessarily saw this as a problem. A young, unmarried daughter could be extremely useful. She might spin wool, prepare food, collect water, help in the fields, look after younger children, sew clothing, clean the house, or assist her parents with whatever work needed to be done. Her contribution was part of the household economy. In fact, medieval families often depended heavily on the labor of unmarried daughters. A girl could spend years learning the skills she would need for married life, while at the same time making the existing household more productive. If marriage eventually came, she would leave with those skills. If it did not, those same skills could become the foundation of her survival. But as the years passed, expectations could change.
A girl who was 15 might simply be considered young. At 20, people might still expect marriage. But if she reached her late 20s or 30s without a husband, her family had to begin thinking differently. There was no single age at which medieval society officially declared a woman permanently unmarried. Life was too varied for such a simple rule, but everyone understood that the chances of marriage changed with age. And once it became clear that a woman might remain unmarried, the question became practical. Where would she live? Who would provide for her? What work could she do? And what would happen when her parents were gone? For many women, the answer was family.
Medieval families could be much more flexible than the modern image of a household suggests. A woman might live with her parents for much of her adult life, then move into the home of a married brother or sister. She might care for an elderly parent, and later with a niece or nephew. She could become the unmarried aunt who was always present in the household, helping with children and domestic work. This arrangement could be perfectly ordinary. An unmarried woman was not necessarily sitting alone in a dark room, separated from everyone else. She was often surrounded by people. Her life could be deeply connected to the lives of her relatives. But being surrounded by family did not necessarily mean being independent.
For poorer women, employment could provide a way to remain connected to society without depending entirely on relatives. One of the most common options was domestic service. A young woman might leave her parents' home and enter another household as a servant. She could prepare meals, clean, wash clothes, care for children, assist with animals, or perform many other tasks. In exchange, she might receive food, clothing, shelter, and wages. For some girls, this was simply a stage before marriage. But for others, it became a long-term occupation. A woman who never married could spend much of her adult life moving between households, earning enough to survive and perhaps saving small amounts of money. Her world could be very different from that of a wealthy unmarried woman living with relatives, but both were part of the same medieval society.
And domestic service was only one possibility. Medieval towns created another world of work. As markets expanded and crafts became increasingly organized, women participated in the production and sale of many everyday goods. Textile work was especially important. Women spun thread, prepared fibers, produced cloth, embroidered garments, and carried out other stages of textile production. Food was another major area. Women could prepare bread, sell food, brew or sell ale in some communities, process dairy products, work with meat, and assist in businesses connected to local markets. Their work could happen inside the home, but the products could end up in the hands of customers outside it.
This blurred the line between housework and business. A woman could be working from home and still be part of the commercial economy.
And this mattered greatly for unmarried women because earning money changed what was possible. A woman who could support herself did not have to depend entirely on the goodwill of a brother or sister. She might rent a room, contribute to a household, save money, or eventually acquire property. Her options were still limited by local laws and social expectations, but income gave her something extremely valuable: a little room to make decisions. In some medieval communities, unmarried women could also become involved in property transactions. They might inherit houses, receive land, rent rooms, lend money, or appear in legal disputes. Women's legal rights varied widely across medieval Europe, so there was no universal rule. A woman in one town could have considerably more economic freedom than a woman living hundreds of miles away. This is why the story of the unmarried medieval woman cannot be reduced to one simple picture. She might be poor or wealthy. She might depend on relatives or earn her own living. She might spend her entire life inside a family home or move from household to household as a servant. She might own property or possess almost nothing. And sometimes, the most important thing separating one woman from another was not whether she had a husband, but whether she had resources. Money could provide choices, family could provide protection, work could provide survival, and property could provide something even more valuable: security. But even a woman with money and work still lived in a society where marriage carried enormous social importance. People naturally asked where she belonged, whose family she came from, and who would stand beside her if trouble came. That is why the medieval town becomes so important to the story. Behind its crowded markets and narrow streets was a world where an unmarried woman could sometimes build a life beyond the walls of her family home. She could work beside other women, trade with customers, form relationships with neighbors, and gradually become known for what she could do rather than simply for whom she had married. And once we step into that world, the picture becomes much more complicated. Because some unmarried women did not merely survive without husbands, they became economically useful enough that other people depended on them. And that is where the forgotten story of medieval working women truly begins.
In the medieval town, a woman's ability to work could change almost everything about her. She might not have a husband to provide a household, but she could still become part of the machinery that kept the town alive. Every morning, markets opened, workshops became busy, ovens were heated, cloth was prepared, animals were brought in, and food was carried from one household to another. Much of this ordinary work depended on women. For an unmarried woman, work was more than a way to stay busy. It could determine whether she remained dependent on relatives or managed to create some space of her own. One of the most common forms of employment was domestic service. Young women often entered another household while they were still teenagers.
They might sleep under the same roof as their employers and spend their days preparing meals, cleaning rooms, carrying water, washing clothing, looking after children, or helping with animals. The arrangement could be demanding, but it also offered something a poor young woman desperately needed: food and shelter. For someone whose family had little land and little money, living as a servant could actually be more secure than remaining at home. Her parents no longer had to provide everything for her, and she could sometimes receive wages in addition to her basic support. Those wages might be saved for a future marriage, but if marriage never came, they could become something else entirely: a small personal reserve. A few coins saved over several years could make a difference when a woman needed clothing, tools, rent, or help during an illness. Medieval wages were generally modest and saving was difficult, but even limited earnings could give a woman slightly more control over her circumstances. Other women worked in textile production. Cloth was one of the most important products in medieval Europe, and women were deeply involved in the work behind it. Spinning was especially widespread. Turning raw fibers into thread required patience and countless hours of repetitive labor.
A woman could perform this work at home while also completing other household tasks. This made spinning especially important because it connected domestic life with the wider economy. The thread might eventually become cloth sold in a market far from the woman who produced it. Her work could disappear into a larger chain of production, but without that work, the chain could not continue. Some women became more directly involved in commercial activity. In towns, women could sell food, clothing, household goods, and other products. They might work beside male relatives or operate small enterprises of their own. In some places, widows had particularly visible roles because they could continue a business after a husband's death. But unmarried women could also appear in commercial records, especially when they possessed skills or property that allowed them to operate independently. A woman who made bread, for example, might sell it to neighbors. Another might prepare and sell cooked food. Someone else could work with cloth, leather, thread, or other materials. The scale was often small, but small businesses could still provide a livelihood. And this is where the medieval idea of work becomes interesting. There was no sharp modern division between a woman's home and her workplace. The two could be the same place. A woman could cook food for her family and then sell some of it. She could spin thread while sitting near the household fire. She could keep animals and sell their products. She could make clothing for relatives and then produce garments for customers. The household itself could become a workshop. For an unmarried woman, this arrangement could offer an advantage. She did not necessarily need to rent a separate commercial building. Her labor could begin with whatever tools and resources were already available around her. But independence had limits. Medieval towns were governed by customs, guilds, local authorities, and religious expectations. Not every occupation was open to every woman, and rules could change from one city to another. Some women could continue family businesses. Others found themselves excluded from certain trades or required to work under male relatives. Even when the law allowed a woman to act independently, social expectations could still make things difficult. A woman running a business had to protect her reputation. Customers needed to trust her. Neighbors needed to regard her as respectable. Creditors needed to believe she would pay. And authorities needed to recognize her right to conduct business. Reputation was therefore almost a form of economic capital. A woman known for honesty could develop relationships that helped her survive. She might buy goods on credit, borrow money, find customers through neighbors, or receive help during difficult periods. A woman who lost that reputation could find the same town much harder to live in. For unmarried women, this mattered even more because marriage could otherwise provide a socially recognized connection. A married woman was known as someone's wife. A servant belonged to an employer's household. A nun belonged to a religious community. But an unmarried woman working independently had to establish her own place in the social network around her. And sometimes she did. She might become familiar to the people who lived on her street. She knew which baker could be trusted, which merchant sold good cloth, which neighbor needed help, and which customer still owed money. Over many years, these relationships could become a form of protection. This is one reason medieval towns could provide opportunities that were harder to find in isolated rural communities. A town offered more people, more customers, more occupations, and more institutions. It also offered more anonymity. A woman did not necessarily have to remain under the constant supervision of her extended family. But urban life came with its own dangers. Rent could rise. Food prices could change. Illness could destroy a woman's ability to work. A fire could wipe out a home or workshop. A bad harvest could make everything more expensive. And an unmarried woman had no husband whose labor or income could automatically absorb the shock. This meant that many women built their security through several sources at once: a little income from work, support from relatives, occasional help from neighbors, perhaps a small amount of property, perhaps savings, perhaps a place within a religious or charitable community. Survival often depended on combining these pieces. There were also women whose work placed them in occupations that required particular knowledge. Midwives, for example, could become important figures within their communities. They assisted during childbirth, supported women through dangerous pregnancies, and sometimes provided practical knowledge about women's health and infant care. Other women worked as healers, nurses, cooks, brewers, laundresses, or sellers of specialized goods. Their work might never have been formally recognized as a profession in the modern sense, but people depended on their skills, and dependence could create authority.
A woman who knew how to deliver babies might be trusted more than a wealthy stranger. A woman who could produce high-quality cloth could have customers who returned to her repeatedly. A woman who knew how to manage a household could become indispensable to the people around her. This gives us a very different picture of the unmarried medieval woman. She was not necessarily waiting helplessly for a husband to arrive. She could be building skills, she could be earning money, she could be creating relationships. And in some cases, she could be quietly building a reputation that gave her a place in the community. But there was one problem that money and work could not always solve. A woman could earn a living, but she still needed somewhere to belong. And for some women, the safest place was not a workshop or a family home at all. It was behind the walls of a religious community, where an unmarried woman could transform her status completely. There, not having a husband was no longer simply a circumstance. It could become a calling.
For a woman who did not have the money, family connections, or circumstances needed to establish an ordinary household, there was another path available in medieval Europe. She could enter a religious community and build her entire adult life around faith rather than marriage. To modernize, a convent might seem like a place where unmarried women were simply sent when there was no husband for them. Sometimes family circumstances certainly played a role, but that explanation is too simple. Religious life could be a genuine choice, and for some women, it offered something that ordinary medieval society rarely offered them: a recognized identity that did not depend on being someone's wife. Inside a convent, a woman belonged to a community.
For a woman who did not have the money, family connections, or circumstances needed to establish an ordinary household, there was another path available in medieval Europe. She could enter a religious community and build her entire adult life around faith rather than marriage. To modernize, a convent might seem like a place where unmarried women were simply sent when there was no husband for them. Sometimes family circumstances certainly played a role, but that explanation is too simple. Religious life could be a genuine choice, and for some women it offered something that ordinary medieval society rarely offered them: a recognized identity that did not depend on being someone's wife. Inside a convent, a woman belonged to a community. A wealthy abbey might own land, vineyards, workshops, livestock, and valuable manuscripts. Its women could live in an environment supported by rents and agricultural income. A smaller religious house might have far fewer resources and require its members to work much harder simply to maintain daily life. But wherever they lived, religious women had responsibilities. Their days were structured around prayer, meals, work, and religious observances. Some prepared food, others maintained clothing and buildings. Some cared for the sick or poor, others worked with manuscripts, taught younger girls, or managed supplies. And this last part is easy to overlook. A convent could be an economic organization. Land had to be managed, rent had to be collected, food had to be stored. Workers had to be supervised. Letters had to be written. Accounts had to be kept. Property had to be protected. A woman with intelligence and administrative ability could therefore gain considerable responsibility inside a religious institution. Some abbesses became powerful figures within their communities. They could oversee estates, supervise other women, communicate with nobles and church officials, and make decisions affecting the institution's finances and property. This was not freedom in the modern sense. A nun could not simply leave whenever she wished.
her life was shaped by religious rules and institutional authority. But compared with the limited options available to some women outside religious life, the convent could provide remarkable opportunities for education, leadership, and community.
Education was particularly significant. Most medieval people did not receive extensive formal education, and opportunities for women were especially restricted. Yet, some religious houses became places where girls and women learned to read, write, sing, study scripture, and copy texts. For an intellectually curious woman, this could completely change the possibilities of her life. She could spend years surrounded by books. She could learn languages. She could correspond with other educated people. She could preserve texts that might otherwise disappear. And in rare cases, she could become a writer whose words survived long after her death.
One of the most famous examples is Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German religious woman who became a writer, composer, preacher, and influential abbess. Her life was extraordinary, but it demonstrates what a religious institution could make possible for a woman who would never live the conventional life of wife and mother. Yet most nuns were not famous. Most lived quietly. They prayed, worked, ate, slept, and repeated the routines of religious life year after year. Their names disappeared from history just as the names of ordinary working women did. Still, the convent gave them something powerful: belonging. Outside its walls, an unmarried woman might constantly have to explain where she belonged. Inside, the answer was simple: she belonged there.
But the religious world was broader than traditional convents. In parts of Northern Europe, another form of female community developed that offered women a different balance between religious devotion and everyday independence. These women became known as beguines. Beguines did not all live in exactly the same way, and they were not simply another type of nun. Many lived together in communities, followed religious practices, and devoted themselves to charitable or productive work, without necessarily taking permanent monastic vows in the same form as enclosed nuns. This distinction mattered. A beguine might work. She could earn money. She could participate in textile production. She could care for sick people. She could teach. She could live among other women. And she could remain unmarried. For women who wanted a religious life without completely withdrawing from the wider world, such communities could provide an unusual alternative. The existence of beguines also shows that medieval women did not always accept the choices placed before them exactly as they were offered. They sometimes created new arrangements when existing institutions did not fit their needs. But these communities still existed within a society that watched female independence carefully. Religious authorities could become suspicious when women's communities became too autonomous, or when their spiritual practices seemed to move beyond accepted boundaries. Some communities were investigated, regulated, or pressured to conform more closely to established religious structures. So even inside religious life, independence had limits. A woman could escape marriage without escaping authority. She could exchange the expectations of a husband for the rules of a religious community. For some women, that was a welcome exchange. For others, it may have been difficult. And then there were women who entered religious life because their families encouraged it. Marriage could be expensive. A family with several daughters might not have enough resources to provide every one of them with a desirable marriage. A convent could therefore become an alternative destination. Instead of dividing family property among multiple marriages, a family could support one daughter entering religious life. This does not mean every nun was unwilling, far from it. Many women genuinely wanted this life.
The important point is that medieval women's choices were shaped by several forces at once: faith, family, money, social expectations, personal preference, and circumstance. The same convent could contain women who had arrived for completely different reasons. One might have dreamed of religious life since childhood. Another might have entered because her family could not afford a marriage. Another might have lost her parents and found security there. Another might have been deeply interested in learning. Their lives could look similar from the outside, while their private reasons were completely different. And outside convents, another group of women was creating a different kind of unmarried life. They did not withdraw from the world.
They stayed inside it. They worked, traded, cared for relatives, and sometimes controlled property. But their independence brought a new question. If a woman could survive without a husband, could she also control a household without one? The answer, in some medieval communities, was surprisingly often yes. And that brings us to the women who possessed something even more valuable than wages. They possessed property.
For an unmarried woman, a small piece of property could change the entire shape of her life. A room in a townhouse, a small cottage, a plot of land, a workshop, or even a share in an inherited estate could give her something that wages alone could not provide: security. Instead of depending entirely on another household, she could have a place that belonged to her, or at least a legal claim to part of it. But medieval Europe had no single system of women's property rights. Laws and customs differed from region to region, and the rights of a woman could depend on whether she was unmarried, married, widowed, wealthy, poor, noble, or a member of a particular community. So the experience of one woman could be completely different from that of another.
Still, there were places where unmarried women could inherit property from their parents or other relatives. If a daughter received a house, land, money, or goods, she might be able to manage those resources herself. Imagine a woman in a medieval town inheriting a small house after her parents died. She now has somewhere to live. She might rent a room to another person. She could cultivate a garden. She could sell part of what she produced. She might lease the property to someone else. She could use its value to support herself. Her life would still be difficult by modern standards, but she would not be completely dependent on a husband. Property could also give a woman legal visibility. If a dispute arose over land or money, she might appear before a local court. If someone owed her money, she could sometimes pursue the debt. If she needed to transfer property, the transaction could be recorded. And this is where medieval documents become fascinating.
Historians sometimes discover women, not because someone wrote their biography, but because their names appear in ordinary legal records. A woman bought a house, another leased a piece of land, someone inherited a property from her parents, another woman lent money to a neighbor, someone appeared in court over a boundary dispute. These records may sound boring, but they reveal something important. These women were making decisions. They were not simply objects being transferred between men. Of course, their freedom was never universal. Local law could restrict what women were allowed to do. Families could pressure them. Male relatives might attempt to control inherited property. A woman could have a legal claim, but still face enormous practical difficulties enforcing it.
And property itself could create conflict. Suppose an unmarried woman inherited a house from her parents. Her brother might believe he had a stronger claim. Other relatives might challenge the inheritance. A distant cousin could appear with an old document. A neighbor might dispute the boundary. The woman could suddenly find herself in the middle of a legal struggle. For someone without money or powerful connections, defending property could be extremely difficult. This is why family relationships remained important, even for women who owned things. A woman might rely on a brother to help with a legal dispute. She might ask a trusted neighbor to witness a transaction. She might form an agreement with another relative.
She could build relationships that protected her interests. In this way, medieval independence rarely meant complete isolation. It was often built through networks. Money helped, property helped, but relationships could be just as valuable. An unmarried woman with a house and a good reputation might become a stable member of her neighborhood. She knew the people around her, and they knew her. Over time, this familiarity could create trust. She might lend small amounts of money. She might rent part of her home. She could employ another woman. She might sell goods to regular customers. She could participate in religious activities at her local church.
Her neighbors might know her not as the woman who never married, but simply by her name and occupation. That distinction matters. We often imagine medieval society as constantly defining women through their relationships with men, but everyday communities were more complicated. People also knew one another as bakers, weavers, traders, landowners, servants, healers, neighbors, and parish members. An unmarried woman could therefore develop an identity based on what she did, and sometimes that identity could become remarkably strong. There were women who managed businesses after inheriting them from family members. Others rented properties. Some became involved in trade. Wealthier women could control significant assets, particularly if they came from noble or prosperous families.
For a wealthy unmarried woman, remaining unmarried could even protect her from certain complications of marriage. Marriage could join her property to another household and create new claims over her resources. Remaining unmarried could sometimes allow her to maintain greater control over what she had inherited. This does not mean women deliberately avoided marriage simply to become financially independent. Marriage remained enormously important, and circumstances varied. But for some women, unmarried life was not necessarily an economic disaster. It could be a calculated way of maintaining what they possessed. There was another form of property that mattered even more to poor women: skills. A woman might own almost nothing but know how to spin, weave, brew, sew, prepare food, nurse the sick, or manage a household. These skills could be exchanged for food, shelter, or money. In a world without modern employment systems, practical knowledge was a form of wealth. A woman who knew how to make something people needed could usually find some way to use that ability. And this helps explain why medieval unmarried women could survive even when they possessed little property. They had labor, they had knowledge, they had relationships, and sometimes they had a place within a family that valued their contribution. But property and work could not solve one problem forever: age. A young woman could work long hours, a middle-aged woman could continue earning, but eventually, everybody became weaker. The woman who had spent decades earning her own living would one day have to ask what happened when she could no longer work. For a married woman, old age might mean relying on children or a husband. For an unmarried woman, the answer could be much less certain. Some had relatives, some had property. Some had religious communities, some had savings, and some had almost nothing. As the years passed, the life she had built would be tested by the one thing medieval society could never guarantee anyone against: the loss of health. And that is where the story of the unmarried woman becomes quieter, older, and much more vulnerable.
For a woman who had built her life around work, family, religion, or property, there eventually came a point when the rules changed again. Age. The strength that had once allowed her to work from morning until night could slowly disappear. A woman who had spent decades spinning thread, carrying water, preparing food, managing a household, or working in a market could no longer depend on her body in the same way. And for someone who had never married, this could create a particularly difficult question: who would care for her when she could no longer care for herself? There was no simple answer. Some women had family. An unmarried woman might have spent much of her adult life helping her parents, and when they became old, she could remain with them until their deaths. Later, a brother or sister might take her into their household. She could live with a married niece, help raise a nephew's children, or become part of another branch of the family.
In this way, family relationships could continue to protect a woman long after marriage had ceased to be a possibility. But family support was never guaranteed. A brother might have several children of his own. A sister might already be struggling to feed her household. Relatives could care deeply about an unmarried woman and still lack the resources to support her. Medieval families were not living with unlimited food, space, or money. So an aging unmarried woman often tried to remain useful for as long as possible. Even when she could no longer perform heavy physical labor, she might cook, sew, supervise children, prepare food, mend clothing, care for animals, or perform other tasks that required experience rather than strength. An older woman could also possess something younger people did not have: knowledge. She knew how to preserve food, she knew which plants could be used, she knew how to prepare cloth. She knew the customs of the household. She remembered family relationships and old agreements. She might know how to care for a newborn or assist another woman during childbirth. Experience itself could become a form of value. But eventually, even useful knowledge could not guarantee security. For women who owned property, old age could be easier. A house could provide shelter. A small piece of land could produce food. A rented room could bring income. Savings could pay for necessities. A woman who had spent decades carefully protecting her resources might reach old age with something many poor women did not have: choices.
Some could use wills to decide what would happen to their possessions after death. They might leave property to relatives. They could give money to religious institutions. They might provide something for a servant who had cared for them. They could donate to the poor. A will was more than a document about death. It could reveal the relationships a woman had built during her lifetime, and sometimes those relationships were surprisingly broad. An unmarried woman might have no husband and no children, yet her will could mention brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, friends, neighbors, servants, and religious communities. Her world had not been empty. It had simply been organized differently. For women without property, the situation could become much harder. If work disappeared and relatives were unable to help, charity might become necessary.
Churches, monasteries, hospitals, confraternities, and wealthy individuals could provide food, clothing, shelter, or occasional financial assistance. Medieval Christianity placed strong importance on charity, and helping the poor was considered an important religious duty. But charity was unpredictable. A woman could not assume that help would always be available. She might have to ask. She might have to rely on a particular church. She might receive food from a wealthy household. She might live in a charitable institution. Or she might simply depend on neighbors. This is why reputation mattered so much throughout an unmarried woman's life.
A woman who had spent 30 years living peacefully in the same neighborhood was not an anonymous stranger when she became old. People knew her. They knew where she had worked. They knew her family. They remembered favors she had given and debts she had paid. That history could become a kind of protection. A neighbor might bring her food. A former employer might help her. A relative might give her a room. A church community might recognize her need. But an isolated woman had far fewer options. And there was another danger that became greater with age: loneliness. Medieval people lived surrounded by others, but that did not mean they could not become isolated. An unmarried woman without close relatives could spend her later years with very few people who genuinely belonged to her.
Some women found companionship through religious communities. Others remained surrounded by extended family. Some formed close relationships with other unmarried women. These relationships could become incredibly important. Women who worked together might share rooms, food, information, and support. Religious communities could create permanent female networks. Even outside formal institutions, neighbors could become something like an extended family. This reminds us that marriage was only one way of creating a household. There were many others. A convent was a household. A group of beguines could form a household. A workshop could contain several women living and working together. A widowed sister's home could become a refuge for an unmarried relative.
A group of servants could share a working environment. Medieval life was full of arrangements that do not fit neatly into the modern idea of a married couple raising children. And some unmarried women became the people others depended on. An aunt might raise children after a family tragedy. An older sister might manage the household after her parents died. A woman without children of her own might spend decades caring for nieces and nephews. She might never have been a wife, but she could still become one of the most important adults in a family. That is one of the quiet contradictions of medieval women's history. A society that placed enormous importance on marriage still relied heavily on women who were not married. They filled gaps. They cared for relatives. They produced goods.
They managed households. They taught children. They maintained religious communities. They supported other women. Their work often became invisible precisely because it was considered ordinary. And when historians later searched for the great stories of medieval Europe, these ordinary women were rarely the ones whose names survived. Their lives were hidden inside household accounts, property records, wills, court documents, and church registers. A few lines might tell us that an unmarried woman owned a house. Another might reveal that she left money to a niece. Another might show that she worked as a servant for 20 years. Another might record that she entered a convent. And then the record ends. We usually never learn what she felt. We do not know whether she was happy with her life. We do not know whether she once dreamed of marriage. We do not know whether she was relieved that it never happened. We only see fragments. But those fragments are enough to reveal something important. The unmarried woman did not necessarily become invisible during her lifetime. She became invisible afterward. And that difference matters. Because while she was alive, she still had neighbors who knew her, relatives who depended on her, customers who bought from her, religious women who lived beside her, and communities that recognized her existence. Her life could be deeply connected to the world around her.
Yet, as generations passed, those connections disappeared from memory, and eventually, only a few lines remained. But there were also women who lived outside these ordinary structures, women whose independence became so noticeable that society began asking uncomfortable questions about them. Who was this woman living alone? Where did her money come from? Why did she have no husband? Who was responsible for her? And was she truly respectable? Those questions could become dangerous, because in medieval Europe, being unmarried was one thing. Living outside the expected social boundaries was another.
By the time an unmarried woman reached the later years of her life, her story could look very different from the one her family had imagined when she was a girl. Perhaps she had remained with her parents and cared for them until their deaths. Perhaps she had spent decades working in other households. Perhaps she had lived in a convent, managed a small business, inherited property, or shared a home with relatives. Whatever path she had taken, she had created a life without becoming a wife, and that life could continue for decades. This is important because medieval people did not disappear from society simply because they were unmarried. An unmarried woman could have a place in her neighborhood, a reputation among local families, regular customers, religious connections, and people who depended upon her.
Her identity might have become much larger than her marital status. She could be known as the woman who made excellent bread, the healer people called when someone was sick, the woman who rented rooms, the skilled seamstress, the aunt who raised children, or the neighbor who had lived on the same street for 40 years. Marriage had not given her identity. Time had. And yet, as she became older, another reality became impossible to ignore. She could no longer work as she once had. For a poor woman, this could be frightening. If her income depended entirely on physical labor, old age could mean losing the ability to pay for food and shelter. Family support could become essential. Some women moved into the homes of relatives. Others were cared for by people they had helped earlier in life. A woman who had spent years caring for her parents might later be cared for by nieces or nephews. Someone who had worked inside a household for decades could sometimes remain there even after she became too old to work. But there were no guarantees. Some women ended their lives in poverty. Others depended on church charity. Some found shelter in hospitals or charitable institutions, and some had planned carefully enough to avoid complete dependence. Property could make an enormous difference. A woman who owned a house could continue living there. If she had tenants, their payments might provide a modest income. If she owned land, she could receive rent or agricultural produce. If she had savings, she could use them during periods when work was no longer possible.
This is one reason wills are so valuable to historians. A woman's final will could reveal an entire network of relationships. She might leave a house to a niece, money to a nephew, clothing to a friend, a small gift to a servant, property to a church, food or money to the poor. These final decisions show that an unmarried woman could accumulate possessions and, importantly, decide what would happen to them. She had lived without a husband, and she could also die without one. Her story did not have to end with a marriage.
Sometimes, however, the most revealing evidence comes from women who left almost nothing behind. Their names might appear only once in a court document or church record. A payment, a dispute, a burial, a small inheritance, a mention in someone else's will. Then, silence. For most ordinary medieval women, this is all history has preserved. We rarely know what they thought about marriage. Maybe some desperately wanted it. Maybe others were relieved that it never happened. Some may have been disappointed by circumstances they could not control. Others may have deliberately chosen a different life. Many probably never thought of their situation as one single dramatic choice at all. Life simply unfolded, one decision and one necessity at a time. That may be the most important lesson. There was no single experience of being an unmarried woman in medieval Europe. A wealthy noblewoman and a poor servant did not live the same life. A nun and a market trader did not have the same freedoms. A woman with inherited property faced very different problems from one who owned nothing. And a woman surrounded by loving relatives lived in a completely different world from one who had been abandoned by her family. The medieval woman who never married was not one character. She was thousands of different women. Some struggled, some prospered.
Some found independence. Some found security inside religious communities. Some spent their lives serving their families. Some worked until old age. And some simply disappeared into the ordinary rhythm of medieval life. But there is something remarkable about the fragments they left behind. They reveal that medieval society was never as simple as the old image suggests. It was not simply men working, women marrying, and children being born. Behind that familiar structure was another world of women who worked, inherited, traded, prayed, managed property, cared for relatives, and built communities of their own. Their lives were rarely celebrated. They did not command armies. They did not sit on royal thrones.
They did not all live under the protection of relatives, and they were not simply women waiting for life to begin. For many of them, life was already happening. They worked, they adapted, they found shelter, they built relationships, they protected what little they had. And sometimes, against the expectations of their world, they created lives that were entirely their own. So when we imagine a medieval woman standing at the edge of adulthood, waiting for a husband who might never come, perhaps we should not imagine an empty future. Her future could still contain work, friendship, faith, responsibility, hardship, and even independence. It simply followed a different path.
They did not usually appear in chronicles describing wars and kings, but they helped keep medieval society functioning. Every piece of cloth spun by a woman, every loaf prepared for a market, every child cared for by an unmarried aunt, every sick person tended by a skilled woman, every household managed by an experienced worker was part of the enormous invisible labor that allowed medieval Europe to continue. And perhaps that is why their stories are worth remembering, because history often asks who ruled, who conquered, who inherited kingdoms, who won wars. But ordinary life depended on people whose names were never written into those grand stories. Among them were the women who never married. They did not all become lonely. They did not all become nuns.
And somewhere in the narrow streets of a medieval town, behind the walls of a convent, inside a crowded family home, or beside a market stall, thousands of women were quietly living those paths. Most of their names are gone, but their lives were real. And for a few moments, we can still find them. And so, as the streets of medieval Europe slowly grew quiet,
The lives of these women faded into the same darkness that eventually covered almost everyone of their time. Most left no famous stories behind, only small traces in old records, forgotten houses, and memories passed from one generation to another. But their lives mattered. They worked, cared, survived, believed, and built lives in a world that did not always make room for them. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember the women who lived outside the story we usually tell. Their names may be forgotten, but their lives were never truly empty.